So, today I'm going to be talking about the Canadian federal government, which is composed in a couple different components. The first two being the Constitution, Constitution and the monarch. The other three are the federal government, or the three branches of the federal government, which I will get into later. Not right now. Let's just focus on the first two, the Constitution and the monarch. Now, the Constitution, pretty basic concept. It is the supreme law of Canada, and it is the rights that citizens and non-citizens of Canada have. This includes Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedom. Our Constitution also sets out the rules which creates our legal and political systems. This also causes division or diversity in our Constitution, making sure different types of government, which includes national and provincial, etc., have different roles or powers. This also does include the power of making laws, and or looking at laws, or observing laws, or creating laws, or just anything to do with laws. Basically, that is in the Constitution. Now that Constitution is done, let's get on to monarch. Monarch is basically just the king or queen, which currently for Canada is King Charles III. But he's actually represented by the Governor General, which is currently Mary Simon. The Governor General basically just signs bills, and then that bill becomes a law. So that's mainly what she does. But yeah, that's the monarch. Basically just the king, who is represented by the Governor General. Moving on from that, I'm going to talk about the three branches of Canada's government. The first one being the legislative branch, also known as Canada's Parliament. Now, this branch basically just makes the laws or debates and passes new laws. And it is composed of a Senate, a House of Commons, and the Governor General. The House of Commons is composed of MPs, or members of Parliament, and they attain their rules through Canadian voters who elect them. Their role/job is to just make major laws in Canada. They also debate, study, and vote on laws proposed for Canada. And lastly, but genuinely not the least, they work for political parties and their constituents. We'd also think they work for the Governor General because eventually, after a bill is looked over and everything, it goes to the Governor General, which then becomes a law. So you kind of think they work for the Governor General, but following along to the House of Commons, almost like a brethren of the House of Commons, is the Senate. Who is involved, you may ask? Well, that's a great question. Basically, just individuals from a variety of political parties are involved in the Senate, and they are, moreover, just called senators. Unlike the House of Commons, where MPs are elected for, senators are not elected for, they are just appointed by the Prime Minister. Once again, unlike how the House of Commons make bills and look over bills and pass them on, members of the Senator just look over bills. They kind of give a second opinion, and eventually will get passed on to the Governor General. The second thoughtful opinion that senators give a bill just gives the bill more perspective and allows for any errors to be discovered or any improvements to be made. Lastly, but again, not least, they work with the House of Commons, and again, you would think they work for the Governor General, but not too sure. Next, I'm going to be talking about sovereign. I think that's how you say it. If not, excuse my mispronunciation, but I don't know. I'm pretty sure this is just everything within the executive branch, but there's not much on the internet to help me, so I don't know. But that does lead us into the executive branch section of this. Basically, it's just the branch that develops and implements laws, and it consists of the Prime Minister, Cabinet, and just any government departments. The Prime Minister is the head of Canada, and to become a Prime Minister, you have to be elected as a leader of a political party. And then after that, you must be elected as a member of the Parliament. And then, after that, you must have the most seats in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister basically just leads the government, and is appointed by the monarch. And if you think about it, he's actually, the Prime Minister is extremely powerful because he chooses the senators, tells the king, or the monarch, who the Governor General should be, and on top of that, he chooses the Chiefs of Justice, which is in the Supreme Court. Although, for the Justice part and the Senators part, it is typically chosen by the Governor General, but the Prime Minister does have a big influence on who the Governor General picks. Now onto the Cabinet. Yippee, I know, right? Who is this consisted of, or who is involved? People in the Cabinet are basically just members of Parliament. and they're also the leaders of the political party in the House of Commons. Overall, though, they are called the cabinet ministers. The Prime Minister, once again, chooses who goes into the cabinet. And the cabinet's job is to execute federal laws, or in simpler words, put laws into action. They're also in charge of different departments. For an example, how cups are in charge of drinks and how plates are in charge of foods, so on and so forth. It's basically literally like a cabinet. Last but not least are the government departments. This is basically just government jobs, which include stuff like fire departments and how they keep fires from being fiery and how they save people, and how police departments, they keep people safe. They make sure there's no crime. Moving on to the last branch of the federal government is the judicial branch. Basically, they just make sure Canada's laws are legal and fair to the citizens of Canada, and they also make sure that laws are consistent with the Constitution. If not, they are deemed invalid. There are two aspects of the judicial branch, which are the Supreme Court and provincial and territorial courts. The Supreme Court of Canada is the highest court in Canada, obviously. Who is involved, you may ask? Just 9 judges from across Canada, And the only reason it's 9 is so that there's no ties. Although, judicial branch, it is different from executive and legislative because it's its own branch. It's not involved, it's involved, but it's not together, because legislative and executive are kind of, they're together, right? But judicial is kind of on its own. Now, basically, it just makes sure that the rights of people are respected and in order, and it also makes sure that laws are kept in order. An example of this can be the rule of law, more so towards the aspect of laws respecting people's rights. This is because the rule of law is basically just making sure that no one is above the law and that anybody, no matter their profession, is equal to the law. If, let's say, a police officer and a janitor breaks a law, both of them are treated the same. It doesn't matter that the police officer works for the government. That's just the rule of law. Everyone's treated the same no matter what. How do people obtain their job in the Supreme Court? Well, I'm glad you asked, because the Prime Minister and the Cabinet will nominate a Supreme Court judge when a position opens up, which is basically after 75 years of a Supreme Court judge being in operation. But after all of that, after the Prime Minister and Cabinet nominate someone, we'll then go through a review by the members of Parliament. Lastly are the provincial and territorial courts. It's sort of like the Supreme Court, but just lower courts, which includes the tax courts, the provincial courts, and federal courts, right? Yeah. They basically just handle cases that are not necessarily as important. Not necessarily as important, but they just handle most everyday cases of crime and anything to do with that. They just handle stuff that the Supreme Court doesn't handle. They are not in control of laws. They just kind of handle, if someone kills someone. And that's it. That's... I swear I understand this. My brain is just not braining when I'm looking at this stuff. But anyways, that's my crappy explanation of all this. I'm just gonna blame it on the Ontario education system. I learned jack, but